Good morning everyone, and thank you all for being here today, and can I particularly thank my colleagues around me whom I'll introduce in a moment. I'd like to firstly say that we are very proud and pleased to be here on Whadjuk country, and we acknowledge the Whadjuk people and their custodianship of land. My name is Linda Burney, and I am the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services. With me today I have Senator Patrick Dodson from Western Australia, and I want to spend a moment on Patrick. Patrick was actually part of, or one of the commissioners 30 years ago of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. So his voice and his authority, his understanding of this is enormously important. I'd like to acknowledge the Attorney General for Western Australia, John Quigley, who has joined us today, and John of course has led an enormous push on age of consent and a whole range of other areas. I'd like to acknowledge my very old friend of over 40 years, Dennis Eggington, who is the CEO of the Aboriginal Legal Service here in Perth, and also Stephen Dawson, whom I met in Adelaide over a year ago when he was the Minister for Disabilities, and I am very happy to see Stephen Dawson now as the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, among a number of other things here in Western Australia. All people are going to say something briefly, but my job is really to introduce and acknowledge people. Of course, today is the 30th anniversary of the handing down of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. What we do know now is that there has been an explosion of First Nations people incarcerated. At the time of the Royal Commission was 14%. It is now 30%. We know that there have been almost 500 deaths in custody since the Royal Commission, 5 in the last 5 weeks, and one of them here in Western Australia. Labor is making a very substantial announcement today of over $90 million to address the issue of driving down incarceration, which of course is one of the main reasons there are so many First Nations people dead in custody. Along with the states and territories, we'll invest in justice reinvestment. There is a wonderful example here at Hawkes Creek in Western Australia. We'll make it easier and more sustainable through the Aboriginal legal services for families to participate in coronial inquest. And we will institute nationally a real-time approach to deaths in custody. And on this, I don't mean just Aboriginal deaths in custody, I mean all deaths in custody. At the moment, there is no responsibility or accountability for that. And in fact, what absolutely outraged me is the 2 deaths in custody early in March in New South Wales only became known to the public because of a Senate estimates questioning at the New South Wales State Parliament. It is not good enough. I'd like to invite Senator Dodson to speak more deeply about the issues that I have raised and to give his perspective on why it is important for Australia to move on this now.
Thank you, Linda, and let me also acknowledge the Attorney General, Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Linda, and my good friend Dennis Eggington. And I must acknowledge John's role in the Royal Commission back in those torrid days when we were looking at what people were being brought into custody for and what happened to them when they actually died in custody. And that was the more sensitive component, I think, of the Royal Commission. And there was the good insights in this state, I think, at the time with Premier Dowding, the police union, No doubt John had some influence in this as well, but in getting a commissioner to look at the underlying issues, the legal, social, cultural factors as to why people were in fact coming into custody, and that was the job and the role that I had. So my role was somewhat different to the other commissioners in the sense that they were inquiring into what happened when someone died in custody. So I spent a lot of time travelling the state, visiting police stations, talking to all sorts of people, taxi drivers, Aboriginal communities, agencies, to find out their perspective on why people were coming into custody. And the Aboriginal units also that were set up, the late Rob Riley chaired the one in this state, and they made a tremendous contribution to helping commissioners understand and the community understand also the challenges that underpin that commission. But today I want to reinforce what Linda has said, because there'll be no national leadership on this, and that's the sad part about it. We've got the Prime Minister prepared to have national cabinet on many things. But this is a matter for national cabinet. The number of deaths that have occurred should be on the national cabinet agenda, and the states and territories should be reporting back within a respectable time on the qualitative outcomes of those recommendations and their implementations within their states. And so in the absence of that national leadership and accountability, Labor's announced part of its platform, if we were to be elected at the next election, to go towards justice reinvestment, and to look at that from the point of view of keeping people out of custody, and particularly young people, but also to deal with the broader issues of domestic violence and social disunity where that occurs and gives rise. But not only those factors, but to look at those underlying factors really, and to work with the governments and the states, and we'll have a joint partnership obviously with the states in the funding of that arrangement. We'll have a unit nationally that makes sure that these justice reinvestment processes are being driven and worked. We'll look at about 30 across Australia, and we will work very closely to design those with those communities. We'll also look at the need to support the legal services and the families when it comes to coronial inquiries, because it's at that point where the analysis of the compliance with the standing orders and the duties and obligations of officers in carrying out their task when someone is actually in custody, that you can do some inquiry, you can probe those instances, and you can make recommendations, proposals for change. And in that way we hope to be able to assist the families, but also the governments, to find ways that can improve the way officers are better educated to deal with the circumstances that the individuals present or don't present when they come into their care. And the third matter will be to look at the real-time recording of deaths, and that'll go to all deaths, so that we're not relying upon newspaper reports as the government currently is on what is happening in this space. And so that we've allowed, the nation has allowed, and previous governments are just as much to blame as the current one, but this current government's been there for a while, and we've been told, and they've been told clearly, that this is a crisis that's in the development, and it needs to have leadership and action. So we'd be looking towards bringing people together very soon after an election, if we were successful at it, to again forensically look at the effectiveness of those recommendations and to look at the positive process and programs that have worked. So Labor's happy to be making financial commitments to that, as Linda said, up to $90 million over the forward estimates of all of those things. And we will do other things. And we're not saying that this is the panacea, but this is a good start, and it sends a clear message that the future Labor government is committed to working with the community to deal with this appalling custody rates and to do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Patrick. Attorney?
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much.
You promoted me. Shadow Minister.
Shadow Minister. It's only a technicality. It'll only be a short time, I'm sure, Linda. I'd like to support the comments of Linda and Patrick, and welcome this announcement that they've come here to Perth to make this morning. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the great Noongar nation upon whose lands we stand. And I would like to gently correct the Shadow Minister on the incarceration rate, because she's quoting the whole of Australia figures. We have our own particular shame in Western Australia, where up to 48% of our male prison estate is Indigenous, 48%, drawn from 2.2% of our population. Something like 55 or 56% of our female estate is Indigenous, and about 80% of our juvenile state is Indigenous. These are times that historians will write of that we lived in a period of shame. Now, it's 30 years since the Royal Commission. As Patrick said, I appeared before him. He was a Royal Commissioner, I was a counsel. It's 30 years, for example, since there was a recommendation to do away with imprisonment for fine default. I'm very proud that the McGowan Labor government did introduce that reform. Yes. Had it have been earlier, Miss Dew, the late Miss Dew, would still be amongst the land of the living. A custody notification service. I'm very proud that the McGowan Labor government introduced a custody notification service, so that every Indigenous person who was taken to custody, the arresting officer is required by law to ring the Aboriginal Legal Service and put the detainee in contact with a lawyer or paralegal immediately. Had that service been available some 5 or 7 or 8 years ago, Mr. Ward would have been part of the land of the living and not died in the horrible circumstances that he died in. But we've got a big reform agenda still to go. As you know, I did at the start of 2019 ask the Council of Australian Attorney Generals to put on raising the age of criminal responsibility on the agenda, and they tasked Western Australia with leading that study. The report is in. There's some states who object to the release of that report. I've urged for its release to inform the public debate. I noticed that one jurisdiction must have leaked it to the Australian, and the conclusions of the report are on the front page of the Australian. But regrettably, all of the weighty information from the medicos, from the police and the support reforms are still hidden from the public. And I think that that is regrettable, very regrettable. Now, what Linda is here today to talk about, of course, is progress in justice reinvestment, because what I've been talking about is end of the cycle reform. What do we do when they have offended? But we've got to get it upstream, and we've got to divert as many young people away from the criminal justice system as possible, because the young people in the criminal justice system, they graduate into the adult criminal justice system and form part of this horrific imprisonment rate that we've got. And locally in the Kimberley, in Halls Creek, there was a group started by the Shire, funded a little bit by the state government. It was modest funding, called Ulla Budu Together. They're a local group with all 90% in Indigenous workers in it. I think the Shire put in $56,000. It's been a raging success, and if I could just quote for a moment from that, there's been a 58% drop in home burglaries, a 33% drop in stealing offences, and a 28% drop in car theft. And that's just three figures. So you can see the huge impact. In one month, arrests for home burglaries fell from 136 down to 33. And this is with modest funding. I'm very proud to say that the McGowan Labor government, in its last budget, committed $1.5 million to breed this program out in the East Kimberley. Now, with what's on promise from a federal Labor opposition and an incoming federal Labor government, we can do big things. We've got to do this with the Martu people in Newman. and we've got to do it in Roban. We've got to actually change the direction of the way we're dealing with, especially young people. We've got to catch them early, as Professor Milton, I think at Milroyd said, the first Aboriginal doctor over here, now a professor and a professor attached to the Telethon Kids Institute, said, most of these children that are going into the criminal justice system are burdened with some sort of difficulty, mental difficulty, and taking them and isolating them in the criminal justice system in detention only exacerbates that, and then it's all over. They end up in the adult criminal justice system and we're facing 48% custody. So the McGowan Labor government welcomes the announcement this morning. We hope that we're working with you within 12 months, within 12 months to breed some of these programs out. I pledge that our government and our Minister for Indigenous Affairs will work very closely with you, Linda. We're a government of law reform in this space and we'll promise to keep it going.
Fantastic. Minister?
Thanks very much, Linda. Can I begin by saying Galakadich Nunga Moor to Kayan Kadak Nijabuja Wajak. Can I too acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we've gathered, the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Linda, thank you. We certainly welcome you here today, and as John said, we welcome this announcement by Federal Labor. As the new Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in Western Australia, taking over from Ben Wyatt, I've got big shoes to fill, but certainly over the past 4 years, the past 8 years, I've represented many of the Aboriginal communities in this state in the Parliament. And as Minister for Environment, it was my pleasure to roll out our Aboriginal Ranger program across the state. We've had a focus on getting Aboriginal people jobs right across the state, whether they're in rural, regional communities. But a crying shame, as has been pointed out today, is that far too many of our young Aboriginal people are being incarcerated. The trial in the Kimberley previously showed that justice reinvestment works.
Yes.
And so we're very open to working with you and Pat and Dennis and others, and Bill Johnson as the new Minister for Corrective Services, with John as Attorney General, to see what collaboratively we can do together to bring those numbers down.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Dennis, our final speaker. Thank you both so much.
Well, good morning everyone, and to our Wajak mob, I pay my respects. Certainly the Aboriginal Legal Service welcomes these announcements this morning. For those who probably don't know, we go cap in hand begging to senior legal teams all over Australia to give them to give their time to us for nothing, to be able to help us with our coronial inquests. And Senator Dodson is correct. It's those places where you can get the answers you need.
Yes.
So instead of going cap in hand, we can actually do those ourselves. We want to do them. We know what we need to do, and it's a wonderful initiative. So thank you very much. The justice reinvestment. I've watched justice reinvestment. I have a personal interest in Burke, a very private personal interest in Burke, and to
His
know
wife's from Burke.
to know those children and young people are getting an opportunity that they didn't have before is tremendous, and having that for our communities here in WA, John, and I think a minister is a great thing. So just let me finish by saying that yes, history will record this time, and I think the attorney was correct in that it is a shame. It's a repugnant stain on this country and its ability to call itself an egalitarian society within a modern world is something diminished, while incarceration rates like this can continue. And also, I think the idea of having it linked in history to a terrible past of colonial wars and frontier wars and things that happened in those days, to have that directly linked to the incarceration rates of today is a terrible shame. So I'm really excited about the announcements from Labor, Senator and Linda, and let's hope that our mob get a better deal from 30 years on from a Royal Commission that gave us hope that we would have a better future Australia. Thank you very much.
Adam and Philippe on the phone.
Look, thank you, everyone. I think it's very clear the sentiment today, and I particularly want to recognise my Western Australian colleagues and friends in their support for what Labor's announcing today, and very much recognise Patrick, who's an extraordinary man, an important member of our caucus, and of course one of the Royal Commissioners. We've got two people calling in with questions, and then we'll go to questions from the people here. Philippe?
Yes, I do have a question. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Minister, can you tell me how your consolidated real-time reporting process currently today will work? How will this be implemented in conjunction with state police services and other agencies?
Yes, of course. So the consolidated real-time reporting will take on board, obviously, sensitivities to make sure that families have been notified and give permission, of course. But as Senator Dodson has said, is at the moment, it is often by luck and chance that you actually hear about a death in custody. We are saying that there needs to be real national leadership on this. It is going to require obviously the cooperation and involvement from states and territory agencies. But we see it as absolutely important that through the Attorney General's Department, that there be a capacity for states and territories to report any death in custody, so that we are not relying on chance to find out what's going on in terms of deaths in custody across the system. So Philippe, I'm not sure if that explains it all, but it would be obviously a collaborative effort with states and territories to make sure that there is national leadership on being clear and transparent and accountable about deaths in custody across the board.
Adam.
And Adam?
Hi guys, how you doing?
Good, thank you.
I've got two questions, is that alright?
It is.
Okay, I guess we've just asked there, I guess what this looks like. Through a lot of the people I talked to, and I think Pat there mentioned it before about, sorry Linda, we couldn't hear you earlier, your whole thing, the sound quality, so sorry if you're repeating, but there's I guess a theme of misinformation or a lack of information, and it's not just about these deaths in custody, hearing about in the newspaper. As it was referred to before, there's still reports and stuff like that aren't made public, and is there going to be any sort of work around that?
This is the unit.
Yeah. I'll get Patrick to answer that.
No worries.
Well, we're proposing to set up a national unit that obviously keeps a tab of these things, and to work closely with the states and territories. And you've got to recall also that whilst there are serious and very heart-rending impacts on the families of the loved ones who die in custody, it also has implications for the prison officers and the police officers who may be involved, and there are trauma situations for them. We're not unmindful of those factors, and that we have to assist those agencies as much as we assist families to make the reforms necessary, so that we diminish the number of people being taken into custody in the first instance, and then to ensure that the services that are required once you're in custody, medical services and other sorts of services, are in fact being delivered. So a monitoring unit of how this works is critical to the effectiveness of it.
Thank you very much. Is there any questions from those present?
Yes.
Yes, far away.
I'll just have one more if I can.
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon.
I don't know if it's been explained or not yet, but I see like there's $90 million for this for the 4 years. Is that solely on justice reinvestment,
No.
initiatives, and is there any more to back up the $90 million in terms of other housing and stuff like that?
So I'll just answer that. It's $79 million out of the package for justice reinvestment, and that will be also, that doesn't count the funding that will come in from states and territories, and $13 million for the coronial inquest support through Aboriginal Legal Services, and we expect the real-time reporting to be something that's done within existing resources of the Attorney General's Department.
How do we make sure that that money hits the ground instead of being eaten up by middlemen?
Oh, it will not be eaten up by middlemen, and it will be direct negotiations with state and territories who are critical partners in this, I can assure you. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Can you just explain, you talked about wanting to involve families more in the coronial inquest process. Can you talk about why that's so important for Indigenous families?
Sure, and I might invite any of the other guests, and Dennis in particular, to talk about that. But as Patrick explained, coronial inquests are the inquests that examined the nature of all deaths, whether there's been any system failures, and I'm sure that the attorney would be able to talk about this as well, and provide recommendations as to make sure that those mistakes are not happen again. And it provides answers to the families about what actually happened. And in the case of many First Nations families, there's not the capacity or the resources to be able to participate and be part of the coronial inquest and get the answers that they need. And this is the motivation behind the funding. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Look, I think that's very important. Most of the calls we get from our families are about what's going on, what's happened, but unless you actually see the raw emotion of what a death in custody actually means to a family, then you've got no idea of the sadness of these deaths, just like any deaths, but particularly deaths that could be prevented. So coupled with answers, I think that the families need to be able to tell people what it's like. It's an impact statement, an ability to say this is what happened, but and families know the blockages, they know where things have gone wrong, and as Linda said, it's a great opportunity to get answers for those families.
Senator Dodson, if you've got to duck off, can I just put a couple of sort of broad questions to you? Does Labor support raising the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14?
Well, it's certainly a lively discussion that we have about it, and we're very much in support of the initiatives that has been taken by the Attorney General's debates and the leadership under our Attorney General in this state, and we're supportive of the cautiousness with which this is being approached, but fully understanding that this is an area where I don't think anyone's happy with the age as it exists of 10 years of age, and Labor would back the Attorney Generals and in this process. If they want to raise it to 12, raise it higher, we'd be very supportive of that initiative.
Does Labor support mandatory sentencing?
Well, that's probably out of my pay rate, but I'm not a fan of mandatory sentencing. I never have been. I think it takes away the capacity of the judiciary to respond in a more constructive and creative way. For instance, we had a magistrate in the Kimberley who used to promise young fellas bicycles if they stayed away from his court. But if there was a mandatory system, he wouldn't have that initiative. So mandatory sentencing is a very important concept that has to be applied very cautiously. Otherwise, why have judges? They're there to make judgments and to weigh the facts and to bring about sentencing in accordance with the law, but sentencing that is tempered by, the circumstances as well. But so if that initiative's taken away from them, then it's pretty difficult to do that.
Last one. Some state and territory Labor governments have been criticised for things like proposed overhauls to youth justice laws that advocates say will incarcerate more Indigenous young people. What are you doing to pressure your state and territory counterparts to meet their closing the gap targets?
Well, the government, as you know, has got a working relationship, I hope, with the peak organisations and the various state and territory ministers in this field. The targets are a bit out, like in terms of way out. From my perspective, I'd rather see them be a bit more immediate, getting results. And of course, I encourage people to seriously look at the urgency component of the lives of these, about the lives of people. It's not about us just, committing funds and seeing the stats alter. This is about people's lives, and the sooner you can redress factors that are causing them grief and harm and sorrow and anger, the better in this space, because we know what that history is.
So,
is there anything in what you're proposing for the coronial inquest? Is there anything designed or intended to improve the way inquests are held? We know they can take years, or is it solely to help navigate families through that process?
Well, I would hope that the inquiry made by council at the coronial system starts to look at the system itself, as well as the compliance of officers with their duties, and ultimately it becomes a forum where the reforms that are necessary are brought to the attentions of government to make those things. I mean, I'm not proposing anything about those coronial inquiries, but the fact that they exist, they're a very, very important component in the criminal justice system to seek reforms, and reform, if necessary, of its own system.
If we can just wrap up on this one, it really isn't about Labor federally saying this is the way it has to be. It's up to states and territories, it's up to communities to design programs and the way to get to those targets, or to meet the sorts of things that we're talking about. Every community is different, and it's called self-determination, and that's what's underpinning all that we've announced today. We're going to have to call it quits there, everyone. Is that?
One or two more if possible. Just what will you do if the states and territories refuse to joint fund some of these community programs that you're hoping to run? How will you put that pressure
Well,
on?
this is a buy-in proposal for states and territories. That is their decision if that's what they decide. But and you can hear from the attorney today and from the minister who's had to go, there is real enthusiasm here in the West, and I expect the same sort of enthusiasm across all states and territories, because they all want to bring down the rates of incarceration.
And just last one from me, would Labor pressure the states and territories to fully implement the Royal Commission's 339 recommendations if it wins the next election?
Labor's position in terms of the Royal Commission is obviously this is a response. The announcements today are a response to the Royal Commission. What I have said very publicly this week, I am not interested in a war of words about who's implemented what. I'm interested in outcomes, which is why we've announced 3 initiatives today that are going to deliver those outcomes. We want to keep, as the attorney said, as Mr. Eggington said, we want to keep people out of custody, and these initiatives are about that.